Hello everyone. Today I will talk about Cavalier Poetry and Robert Herrick. I hope you enjoy my presentation. Let's begin. Cavalier was first used by Roundheads as a term of abuse for the wealthy royalist supporters of King Charles I and his son Charles II of England during the English Civil War, the Interregnum, and the Restoration. It was later adopted by the royalists themselves. Although it referred originally to political and social attitudes and behavior, of which clothing was a very small part, it has subsequently become strongly identified with the fashionable clothing of the court at the time. Prince Rupert, commander of much of Charles I's cavalry, is often considered to be an archetypal cavalier. The Cavalier Poets was a school of English poets in the 17th century that came from the classes that supported King Charles I during the English Civil War. Charles, a connoisseur of the fine arts, supported poets who created the art he created. These poets in turn grouped themselves with the king and his service, thus becoming Cavalier Poets. A cavalier was traditionally a mounted soldier or knight, but when the term was applied to those who supported Charles, it was meant to portray them as roistering gallants. The term was thus meant to belittle and insult. They were separate in their lifestyle and divided on religion from the Roundheads, who supported Parliament, consisting often of Puritans. Cavalier poetry is different from traditional poetry in its subject matter. Instead of tackling issues like religion, philosophy, and the arts, Cavalier poetry aims to express the joy and simple gratification of celebratory things much livelier than the traditional works of their predecessors. The intent of their works was often to promote the crown, and Cavalier poets spoke outwardly against the Roundheads who supported the rebellion of Parliament against the crown. Most Cavalier works had allegorical and classical references. They drew upon the knowledge of Horace, Cicero, and Ovid. By using these resources, they were able to produce poetry that impressed King Charles I. The Cavalier poets strove to create poetry where both pleasure and virtue thrived. They were rich in reference to the ancients as well as pleasing. Commonly held traits certainly exist in Cavalier poetry in that most poems celebrate beauty, love, nature, sensuality, drinking, good fellowship, honor, and social life. In many ways, this poetry embodies an attitude that mirrors Carpe Diem. Cavalier poets certainly wrote to promote loyalist principles in favor of the crown, but their themes ran deeper than that. Cavalier poets wrote in a way that promoted seizing the day and the opportunities presented to them and their kinsmen. They wanted to revel in society and come to be the best that they possibly could within the bounds of that society. This endorsement of living life to the fullest for Cavalier writers often included gaining material wealth and having relationship with women. These themes contributed to the triumphant and boisterous tone and attitude of the poetry. Platonic love was also another characteristic of Cavalier poetry, where the man would show his divine love to a woman, where she would be worshipped as a creature of perfection. As such, it was common to hear praise of womanly virtues as though they were divine. Best known of the Cavalier Poets are Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Thomas Carew, and Sir John Suckling. Most of the Cavalier poets were courtiers, with notable exceptions. For example, Robert Herrick was not a courtier, but his style marks him as a Cavalier poet. Who is Robert Herrick? Born in Cheapside, London, he was the seventh child and fourth son of Julia Stone and Nicholas Herrick. He was named for his uncle, Robert Herrick, a prosperous Member of Parliament for Leicester, who had bought the land Greyfriars Abbey stood on after its dissolution. Nicholas Herrick died in a fall from fourth-floor window in November. When Robert was a year old, the tradition that Herrick received his education at Westminster is based on the verse beloved Westminster in his poem Tears to Thamesis. But the allusion is to the city, not school. It is more likely that he attended the Merchant Taylors' School. In 1607, he became apprenticed to his other uncle, Sir William Herrick, a goldsmith and jeweller to the king. The apprenticeship ended after only 6 years when Herrick, at age 22, matriculated at St. John's College, Cambridge. He later migrated to Trinity Hall, graduating in 1617. He became a member of the Sons of Ben, a group centered upon an admiration for the works of Ben Jonson. Herrick wrote at least 5 poems to Jonson. Herrick was ordained in 1623 and in 1629 became the vicar of Dean Prior in Devonshire. In 1647, in the wake of the English Civil War, Herrick was ejected from his vicarage for refusing the Solomon League and Covenant. He then returned to London, living in Westminster and depending on the charity of his friends and family. He spent some time preparing his lyric poems for publication and had them printed in 1648 under the title Hesperides, or the works both human and divine of Robert Herrick, with a dedication to the Prince of Wales. When King Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Herrick petitioned for his own restoration to his living. He had obtained favour by writing verses celebrating the births of both Charles II and his brother James before the Civil War. Herrick became the vicar of Dean Prior again in the summer of 1662 and lived there until his death in October 1674 at the age of 83. Herrick wrote over 2,500 poems, about half of which appear in his major work Hesperides. Hesperides also includes the much shorter Noble Numbers, his first book of spiritual works, first published in 1648. He is well known for his style and in his earlier works, for frequent reference to love-making and the female body. His later poetry was of a more spiritual and philosophical nature. Herrick sets out his subject matter in the poem he printed at the beginning of his collection, The Argument of his book. He dealt with English country life and its seasons, village customs, complimentary poems to various ladies and his friends, themes taken from classical writings, and a solid bedrock of Christian faith, not intellectualized but underpinning the rest. It has been said of Herrick's style His directness of speech with clear and simple presentation of thought, a fine artist working with conscious knowledge of his art, of an England of his youth, in which he lives and moves and loves, clearly assigns him to the first place as a lyrical poet in the strict and pure sense of the phrase. Herrick never married, and none of his love poems seems to connect directly with any one woman. He loved the richness of sensuality and the variety of life, and this is shown vividly in such poems as Cherry Rip, Delight in Disorder, and Upon Julia's Clothes. The overriding message of Herrick's work is that life is short. The world is beautiful, love is splendid, and we must use the short time we have to make the most of it. This message can be seen clearly to the virgins to make much of time, to daffodils, to blossoms, and Corinna's going Maying, where the warmth and exuberance of what seems to have been a kindly and jovial personality comes over strongly. His poems were not widely popular at the time they were published. His style was strongly influenced by Ben Jonson, by the classical Roman writers, and by the poems of the late Elizabethan era. This must have seemed quite old-fashioned to an audience whose tastes were tuned to complexities of the metaphysical poets such as John Donne and Andrew Marvell. His works were rediscovered in the early 19th century and have been regularly printed ever since. The Victorian poet Swinburne described Herrick as "the greatest songwriter ever born of English race." Despite his use of classical allusions and names, Herrick's poems are easier for modern readers to understand than those of many of his contemporaries. And one of his most known poem, "To the Virgins to Make Much of Time." Okay, that's all for today. Thank you all for listening. Have a nice day.